Well, big warm welcome to everyone this morning. We're here for Qualitative Research Methods with Dr. Megan Lee. This is our second workshop for the year with Megan, which has been very, very popular. So I'm Alison. I'm from the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. I encourage you to become a member of the association, and in that way keeps these workshops for postgraduates running all year, which are free to all of you. And I'll also post where you can watch the recording in our YouTube channel. And I'll also keep an eye on the chat box too. I'll post what we're doing next week with Megan again. So thank you. That's enough from me. Thanks, Megan.
No worries. Thank you, Alison. I do want to reiterate what Alison said about the SCPA and joining the SCPA. I did my PhD at Southern Cross I finished in 2022. And I found being a member of the Southern Cross Postgrad Association was one of the best things that I ever did. I had a couple of issues during my PhD, and I found that the Postgrad Association was such an amazing support for me in times where I needed support external to the university. I also made a heap of friends who were also involved in the Postgrad Association. We joined a PhD writing group, and was a massive support for each other. And we're currently writing a paper about how of our experiences with that writing group as well. And then, of course, the Praxis conference that happens every year, where you get practice at presenting your research in a really collegial environment. And that's a really amazing place to network and talk to people who are going through the same sort of scenario as you. So I 100% recommend the SCPA, joining the SCPA. It's one of the best things. I don't know if I would have finished my PhD without their support. So yeah. So let's move on now to qualitative research. My name's Megan Lee. As I said before, I'm an assistant professor at Bond University at the moment. I have a PhD in psychiatry, so everything that revolves around food and mental health. If you're interested in that, I do have a couple of socials at the Food Mood Doctor, or my website foodmooddoctor.org. You'll also find all of the SCPA workshops that we have done in the past and updated to this year on there under presentations as well. So if you do want to go and find one that you have missed out on, they're all in there. Or you can come to the ones this year, which are all updated and new. So what we will cover today. So today we are exploring qualitative research methods. Next week at the same time, on the same day, we will then be moving into qualitative data analysis. So that's a brand new workshop. We have never done that one before, but we found that a lot of people from the last 2 years after we did this workshop really wanted to dive into the actual analysis and how to analyze word data. So that will be next week if you are interested in joining that one as well. But today we will cover the differences between quantitative and qualitative research methods, the importance of qualitative research in particular in forming a foundation for all quantitative research. We'll do a deep dive into the different types of methodologies, such as focus groups, interviews, and ethnography. Then we will talk about collecting qualitative data and the research ethics behind that, and how they are a little bit different to quantitative analysis. And then we will move on to a brief overview of qualitative data analysis, and in particular, Braun and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, which is the most widely used analyses, which is what we will be doing next week in more detail. So let's get to know you a little bit. So in the chat box, I want you to answer one or more of these questions. Who has conducted qualitative research before? And if so, what was your project? Who has never considered qualitative research before, and why you think that that is the case? Who is considering qualitative research in their future research? And what promoted you to come to this workshop? So feel free to answer one or more of those of those questions. They're not quite research questions yet. And see. Yes, Ella, what promoted you to come to this workshop?
I tried to press enter and then I thought it would just, I could then give my answer, but then it just shared that. So,
That's
um,
okay. You can tell me if you like.
yeah, I will. I'm doing my honours this year in psychology, and it's been a few years since I finished my undergrad. So I thought that I would jump on and just refresh my memory on sort of psychology topics before
Nice.
starting uni. Yeah,
And so you're doing honors this semester or next semester?
this
Study.
semester. Yeah,
Okay, and when does the study period start?
the 10th of March at
Oh,
SCU.
okay, nice. And so
Yeah.
have you reached out to supervisors yet, or you're still not up to that stage?
We had to put in our preferences last week for the thesis topics, and so I don't know yet which one I'll get. Um,
Which one do you most want to do?
um, I really like the look of. There's one on. I haven't like given it a lot of thought yet, but it's to do with sport and um, yeah, like I just anything to do with sport sort of interests me. So I saw that and I was like, oh, I'd like the look of that. Um, yeah, so not sure yet.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Ella. Melissa says, I used Braun and Clark for barriers and enablers to a healthy diet in Tasmanians when I was doing an undergrad at UTAS. We'll need to do more core work in my postgrad. That's awesome. So, healthy diet in Tasmanians, that's really close to what I do with my healthy diet and mental health stuff. So that really is up my alley. Natalie, qualitative research conducted facilitating yarning sessions. My research is with Aboriginal students in VET. Yes, Natalie, that's really interesting and exciting. We're finding at Bond University, I teach a research methods unit, and their main assessment task is to create a research proposal that they would like to do in the future. And a lot of students do suggest qualitative research using yarning. And what's really cool and interesting at Bond at the moment is that we are learning about how to integrate Indigenous ways of learning and knowing, and qualitative research in itself really is very aligned with the Indigenous ways of knowing and learning. So qualitative research is being built into a lot of the psychology degree now at Bond for that reason. So yeah, that's really exciting and interesting. Chrissy, I've only learned about qualitative research in my undergrad, hoping to get a qual research project for psych honors. That's exciting. Is there anyone doing qualitative research? Sally Sargent, I know, is a quali researcher. She was my principal supervisor for my PhD, so she's one to look for. Alison, I've done qualitative research using historical documents. That's exciting. That was your postgrad work, wasn't it, Alison?
Yeah, that was my PhD.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah.
You feel free to share throughout when we go through. Do you want to give us a little brief summary of what it was all about?
Oh, me? Oh,
Yeah.
sure. So I did mothers in mental institutions in the 20s and 30s. So quite a specific sort of historical work. And I started with a family member and I got access to their mental patient files as a family member. And I thought, oh, great, I've got a PhD because I got 40 years of 120 pages of a mental patient file. And of course, my supervisors go, well, you can't really just do a PhD on one person. You'll have to go and get some more. So I use my family member as the sort of limitation or criteria, like to go and get more files. So the same diagnosis in the state of Victoria in the same decade. So
Very cool.
then discourse analysis, how mothers were talked about in the sort of medical discourse, how doctors were reporting their symptoms and behaviours.
Very good. Discourse analysis, you can give us a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
Amber, I've always been more focused on quant research and plan to do some quali in my PhD, so I'd like to learn more about it. That was exactly the position I was in. I'd never done qualitative research before until I did my PhD, and I wanted to run focus groups with people, finding out what their experiences were with food and mental health. So in the very same spot that I was in, I'm hoping to use mixed methods design in my psych honours this year. So I'm looking to have a deeper understanding on how to incorporate qualitative research, and we'll touch on that today as well. And Susan, I would love to do qualitative research for my psych honours on understanding attachment style for parents and children with ASD. Very good. Excellent. Well, let's get going then. First, we will have a little bit of a discussion about the differences between quantitative and qualitative research. So quant research is what everybody usually, particularly in psychology, has a foundation in. Qualitative research has more foundations in the education faculty, which is exciting, and they know all about ontology and epistemology and ways of knowing. When we do psychology, we are grounded in the scientific method, and not a lot of qualitative research is spoken about. We're changing that now, though. So quant research uses data containing numbers to count, examine, and interpret relationships, associations, causality, and differences between groups. And you'll know from the research question, from those words, what type of analysis is being used. So relationships is very synonymous with a correlational analysis. Prediction is synonymous with regression. Differences between groups is either t-tests or ANOVAs. Causality is aligned with randomized control trials. So quantitative research is very much aligned to that scientific method, which we'll talk about in a second, whereas qualitative research flips the scientific method around on itself, on its head. And we use data containing words like to explore, observe, and interpret individuals' experiences. So we're looking at the deep meaning. Since my PhD, I have become a mixed methods researcher, and I believe that you cannot find out the truth behind a phenomenon by doing either quantitative research or qualitative research alone. So I believe that you need the quantitative research to find out how things generalize to the population, but you also need qualitative research to see what the deep underlying meaning behind things is. Qualitative research is subjective. It uses very different methods of collecting information. It's exploratory and open-ended. But I truly believe that all research, being a pragmatic researcher, should use elements of both. So quantitative research, and I talk about this scientific method where we start with a theory about something in the world. We hypothesize about what will happen. We create a research design to test that hypothesis, collect data, analyze the data, observe what happened in the data, and then we either confirm or we don't confirm our hypotheses and our theory. That's how quantitative research works. Usually in that confirmation of your theory or your hypothesis, you'll come up with brand new questions about your phenomenon or the topic of interest, and it will circle back around to theory, hypothesis, research design, data collection, analysis in this constant cycle of questioning and improving the science. And if you're in research long enough, you will start to question your own previous papers. So your earlier papers and your findings will be upgraded and updated, which is really cool. Whereas qualitative research turns that scientific method around on its head, where we use inductive thinking. So we start with an observation about the world. We create a research design, usually interviews, focus groups, or observations of people in the world to explore patterns of meaning. Then we hypothesize about what we found and build a theory from that. Now, what's really exciting and interesting, and why I don't understand why quantitative and qualitative researchers kind of end up at parties like not talking to each other in groups, is that this inductive thinking should always come first. So when you think of an observation in the world that's brand new that may not have been tested quantitatively, you build focus groups or interviews to find out the underlying meaning behind that observation, to build a hypothesis, to find a theory that then moves into quantitative analysis. So focus groups and interviews are usually the foundational thing that you do before you create a survey or an experimental research design, to find out what it is that people are actually experiencing so that you can then quantitatively analyze the associations and relationships. So they go hand in hand. So quantitative research with numbers is deductive. Qualitative research is inductive, as we just saw. Quantitative research measures objective facts and focuses on variables like independent variable, dependent variable, outcomes, and predictors. There is a firewall between researcher processes and researchers' values. So when we do quantitative research, we are told to remove ourselves from the data, have no influence on the data. Most of the time in experimental research, blinding the researchers from who is in what group, who is in the control group, who's in an intervention group, to remove biases or to remove influence of the researcher on the data. And it's very cross-contextual in many cases. Wherever qualitative research documents social reality and how meaning is constructed. It focuses on in-depth lived experience of people's worlds, and values are present and explicit. What that means is that there is no longer a firewall between the researcher process and researcher's values. The researcher becomes embedded in the research. They are also, the influence of the research can improve the research, but we must always be very aware of our own biases, ideals, and values that we bring to the research, because that can change every aspect of the research, from designing your research, conducting the research, managing participants, engaging with participants, the way that you interpret what the participants say in the data is all based on everything that has happened to you in your life and the perspectives that you have. So everything is funneled through that. So we do, and we will do this today, an exercise on reflexivity that helps to acknowledge and minimize researcher bias in qualitative research. It's one of my favorite activities. Some differences in analysis. So quantitative analysis uses statistical analysis. You pop it into SPSS or into R, and it gives you your answer. Whereas qualitative research, when you are analyzing words, it's much more driven by groups and researchers together and building a story of what the participants mean and the underlying meaning. So thematic analysis is creating themes from the words that the participants speak. So it's a lot different, and it takes a lot longer to do qualitative analysis than it does to pop your data into SPSS and get an answer. So a lot of students will, particularly in honours, choose a qualitative research design because they think that they're scared of the quantitative data analysis, but then realize it's actually a lot more work to do. Quantitative research is highly structured. using that scientific method. It's very specific. There's a separation of data, the researchers from the data, and it generalizes to populations from a small sample. We can say that if we ran the data 95% of the time, we would get this answer. That's how statistics works. Qualitative analysis is loosely structured on purpose. You want it to be like that. You want it to be loosely structured so participants feel comfortable revealing their innermost thoughts. There's a holistic perspective. It's not specific. There's an intimacy between the researcher and the participants and the data. You move towards your data, you move away from your data. It's really important to spend time in the world mulling over your data, thinking about your participants and what they said, rather than always be doing. So I find, interestingly, when I'm doing qualitative research, that going and getting a massage is one of the best things that I can do to stop my hands from moving and my brain from wanting to be on a computer tippy tapping all the time, and just stopping and focusing my thoughts on what the data is. And that's a really important, stepping away from your data is a really important aspect of qualitative research. And it doesn't really generalize to populations. And most people say that's a limitation of qualitative research, but it's just actually a part of it. We generalize to contexts. So the strengths of qualitative research: we explore in-depth feelings, motivations, opinions, experiences, morals, perceptions, values, understanding, perspectives, and meaning. It provides an insight into real-life situations that we may be unable to ever measure in a laboratory or using a survey. And it complements quantitative analysis. Like I said before, it should always be used as a foundation before you build a survey. You should always do a focus group or an interview, set of interviews to find out what people are actually experiencing with that phenomenon before you build your survey. But it also complements quantitative analysis inside surveys. So if you've got a survey with a list of questions, having an open-ended selection can give you a much more insight into what that phenomenon is. And for myself, in my honours project, I did a cross-sectional survey of postpartum mums and asked them about body image and eating attitudes and how that impacted their well-being. I came away from my honours project with this niggling feeling like two mums could answer the same question in the same way and have different reasons. So I really wanted to get mums together in a room, 6 to 8 mums with their kids running around, having a cup of tea and a piece of cake, and really talking about their experiences with body image and eating attitudes. Now, we ended up doing that with my honours students now, and what we found in the qualitative focus groups was very different to what we found in the quantitative surveys. So it just shows that you could miss important things if you stick to quantitative research alone. But quality research does have its weaknesses. And this is one of my favorite memes about qualitative research, is that one does not just do qualitative research because they think it will be easier than doing stats. It is not the case. So generalizability to populations is considered to be a weakness of qualitative research. There's a lot of literature saying that that might not actually be such a problem that quantitative researchers believe. There is a high volume of data depending on how many interviews or focus groups that you do. A 1 hour interview takes 4 to 5 hours to transcribe. So if you do 10 interviews, there's 40 to 50 hours of transcribing alone before you even start your data analysis, which is why focus groups tend to be a little bit better, because you get 6 to 8 people's opinions in 90 minutes instead of 8 hours. Most researchers will need to unlearn quantitative habits and terminologies. I still fall into this trap quite often of using quantitative terminologies in my qualitative writing. So it's a completely different way of learning and knowing. It's very time consuming. As I said, those transcriptions take a really long time, but the data analysis process is also quite long. There's 6 stages of data analysis that we'll talk about later, and those 6 stages can they're not linear. You don't just go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 through to 6. They sometimes go backwards and you end up all the way back at the start, and then moving close to your data, moving away from your data and going. It's really an interesting way of analyzing data. And writing your report is still part of the data analysis, and your themes and your codes and your data can change while you're still writing up your report. So it can be much more time consuming. And if you are doing an honors project on qualitative research, I would highly recommend being up to data analysis before, like, the second half of your thesis and managing that time. Right. Any questions about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research before we move on to the different types of qualitative research? No questions? All right. So there are several different types of qualitative research: interpretive, phenomenological, grounded theory, case studies, postmodern research, and critical research. We will go through these in turn. So interpretive explores how people make meaning of a situation or an event. We collect data from interviews, focus groups, observations, or content, like exploring writing, like Alison did with her historical documents, or social media posts. That's a really cool one now, because Facebook and X and all these social media platforms are publicly available data. And when you sign up for these platforms, you waive your rights to confidentiality, etc. We can basically use anything that's written on those platforms for research. Don't even need ethics. So social media posts are really cool. So I would love to do like a interpretive research design on hashtags, postpartum hashtags, maybe. That would be really cool. So you can do interpretive research on hashtags. You can do it on actual Facebook groups. I know we have researchers at Bond at the moment who are interested in non-offending pedophiles. So these are people who have not ever committed a assault against a child, but do have attraction to children. And they have Facebook groups that are closed, obviously, where they talk to each other to help support each other in not offending, basically. So this research is happening, and the researchers have access to the Facebook groups to see the chats that they are having, and they're doing research on those chats, which is really quite cool. It's very, very interesting research. We analyze patterns or common themes that happen within the posts or within the hashtags or within the interviews. The outcome is a rich descriptive account that makes reference to, descriptive accounts that makes reference to the literature that helps frame the study. So you really start out with knowing what is going on in the literature and then using what is known in the literature to support your findings. So in the chat box, can you provide an example of a research question that could be answered using interpretive qualitative research? And feel free to pop these into ChatGPT or to Copilot. I would love to see what their examples are. If you can't think of one yourself.
Nat, did you want to comment? Your mic's off. Okay.
So pop it into OpenAI, or feel free to provide your own example of a research question that could be answered using this type of qualitative research. Feel free to turn your microphone on or just pop it into the chat box. Let's have a look. How do Aboriginal students experience success in VET and why? That's a good one. Thank you, Natalie. How do child protection workers perceive and experience trauma-informed training in non-government organisations? Great. Oh, here's a ChatGPT one. How do individuals experiencing homelessness in urban areas perceive the role of social services in their daily lives? Great, thank you, Melissa. How do Australian Tinder users construct and negotiate their self-presentation in online dating interactions? Yes, you could do that. You could access the app somehow and do something really cool with the different dating interactions. That's very good. All right, let's move on to the next type of research design. So phenomenological, this is the one that I use the most, and this is when you're exploring the lived experience of an event or a phenomenon. We're going to do an exercise on reflexivity in a moment, but phenomenological research really leans into this reflexivity, where the researcher attempts to acknowledge their attitudes, biases, the beliefs, the judgments regarding the phenomenon that they are measuring, allowing the researcher to see the phenomenon intuitively from the perspective of the individual. So you're casting aside all of your beliefs about this research topic and really trying to see through the participants' eyes. Braun and Clark have done a lot of writing about reflexivity and reflexive thematic analysis. I'll give you an example of what I'm doing at the moment, and then you can pop into the chat box an example of a research question that can use phenomenology. So at the moment, we are doing interviews with Australian vegan men, and we're asking them about their motivations to become vegan and how this impacts their social identity. And none of the research team currently, except for one research assistant who came on, is a man. So most of us are women. None of us are actually vegan. The research team does have plant-based dietary followers in it, but none of us are purely vegan. So when we are running our interviews, we need to let the phenomenon through the eyes of the men who are vegan and cast aside any beliefs or attitudes or biases that we have towards men and towards people who are following a vegan diet. So it's a really interesting and exciting way of doing research, and you continuously keep a reflexive journal monitoring your thoughts and beliefs about your participants and the research topic. So pop into the chat box what you think a research question that we could use phenomenology. Fatima, I think this one was for interpretive, exploring how first-time mothers make sense of their transition into motherhood as exploring their emotions and feelings as new mums. We could also use phenomenology for that. So particularly the research team could include mums and people who aren't mothers, and really tapping into your experiences as a mother or not having children and removing those attitudes and biases so that we can see the phenomenon of their emotions and feelings as new mums through their eyes. So that's a really good example of both an interpretive and a phenomenological study. How parents of ASD children respond to finding out their child has ASD. That's excellent, Susan. Yes. I'm reading a book at the moment on self-compassion by Kristen Neff, and she explores her own experiences with finding out that her child has ASD and applying self-compassion and compassion to her child and self-compassion to herself. So that's a really good phenomenological one, particularly for research teams who don't have children who experience the symptoms of ASD, or those who have, and also tapping into your own beliefs about your closeness to that spectrum, and knowing that ASD is a spectrum from very mild to very severe. Some of us might actually identify with parts of the spectrum ourselves. So really journaling and reflecting on those biases as well, if you are a researcher in this type of example. ChatGPT, what is the lived experience of new mothers navigating the transition to parenthood? Excellent. What is the lived experience of non-government child protection workers implementing trauma-informed practices? Great. So going in, talking to the workers, the child protection workers, about implementing those trauma-informed practices and what their experiences are, the vicarious trauma even that they experience. So reflexivity is a really important part of all qualitative research, but mostly very, very important in phenomenology. And I also believe that all quantitative researchers should keep a reflexive journal while they're completing their quantitative research. And there's a couple of papers that support that argument also. The next one is grounded theory. Grounded theory explores data that is grounded in theory, as the name suggests. So it involves comparing units of data against one another until categories, properties, and hypotheses that state relations between these categories and properties are identified. These hypotheses are tentative and suggestive, not tested in the study. So it's really grounded in the data. So let's see, grounded theory is not really something that I do myself, so my understanding of it is quite shallow. So let's see what you can come up with for a research question grounded theory, and also what the internet brings up to help us clarify grounded theory in more detail. Beck's got one for phenomenology, I think. So how Aboriginal people responded to the outcome of the Voice to Parliament referendum. Excellent. Yes, definitely. And we would have to be very sensitive in any of these projects that involve Indigenous and First Nations people. One of the main ethical requirements from the NHMRC is that a member of the Indigenous community which you will be collecting from should be involved from the beginning of your research design all the way through to interpretation of the data. So that's a really important ethical consideration for anyone who is considering to do work with First Nations people. Chrissy, how do non-government child protection workers develop strategies to implement trauma-informed practices in the daily work? Yeah, good. So this one's for grounded theory. How do teachers develop and adapt their teaching strategies in response to student engagement in the classroom? So as you can see, all these research questions are kind of grounded in the theory behind the research question. So there would be theory on teaching strategies for student engagement in the classroom. So you would be working on a foundation or a framework of that theory and analyzing your data in relation to the theory. All right, let's move on to the next one. Case studies. So these ones are a little bit easier than grounded theory. Oh, just wait, we've got one more. Grounded theory. Internet view on grounded theory. Oh, here we go. Grounded theory is a research method concerned with the generation of theory which is grounded in the data that has been systematically collected and analyzed. Great. Thank you, Melissa. Case studies. A descriptive intensive analysis of one individual, one unit, or one phenomenon for its typicality or uniqueness. So case studies are usually done on people who have or things or in the environment that are very rare and you wouldn't see very often or even once in the history of lifetime. Different methods can be used to conduct this analysis, but usually case studies are grouped together by commonality. A really good example of this is in the psychology research. One of the greatest cases where Phineas Gage, he was a worker on the railways. He had a steel rod pass through his prefrontal cortex, impacting his personality. So it went straight through the part of his head and removed the part of his brain that was responsible for personality. And he went from being this kind, gentle soul to this really aggressive, violent individual because of the impact of the removal of that part of his prefrontal cortex. Now, it would be immoral for us to ever try to replicate this study in research. And so Phineas Gage may be the only person who this has ever happened to. So he became a very, very important and influential case study in psychology for this reason. And this can happen with other rare things as well, which is quite cool. So can you think of any examples of research questions that can be used using case study research? Susan, the effects of NDIS dropping certain support from its list of support? Yeah. What sort of supports are they dropping? That's the question. No good. What strategies did a small community-based non-profit organisation use to successfully increase volunteer engagement during a period of organisational growth? Yes, Melissa, good. So that is a case study because it's one specific community-based non-profit. Good. Neurofeedback. Oh, neurofeedback, really? Is that what one of the things that they're dropping from the NDIS? Natalie, how do students experience success in vet through exploring a case study in a regional area? Yeah, and that's a really good point, is doing case studies of people who are rural and remote. They're very far away from the population and their experiences may be very different to some of the First Nations people who are in the cities or in the towns. Very good. James, how do frontline workers in the mining industry perceive the impact of automation and robotics on job security and workplace dynamics? Yeah, that could be done. How did a shark attack during competition influence the professional mindset of an elite athlete? That's a good one, Ella, because that may have been the only time in the world where an elite surfer was actually attacked by a shark during competition. So that's a really good example of a case study, and getting Mick Fanning in to describe his experience, because that may never happen again as well. Very good. Thank you very much. Critical research critiques the social, cultural, and psychological assumptions regarding a present-day context with the goal of empowering individuals and enabling change. It challenges current power distributions and the status quo, as opposed to merely revealing meaning. So this is all about making social change. Research questions address race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, power structures that serve some groups' interests but oppress others, and how truth and knowledge are actually constructed. Feminism theory is highly used in critical research. It's all about removing those oppression of minorities. So can you think of a research question that would be good to answer this type of qualitative research? Adult time for adult crime. Interesting. Do you mean a research project around children serving adult times when they do an adult crime? Is that what that means? How does systemic policies and practice impact the cultural identity and well-being of Indigenous children in and out of home care? Good. That's really good. It's the current government strategy. Really? Wow. Okay. That shows my ignorance. It would be an interesting research project. So the point of the research project would be to contest adult time for adult crime. Yeah, very interesting. How do media portrayals of mental health impact societal attitudes towards individuals living with mental illness? Very good. So trying to remove stigma around mental health illness. Great. All right, and we'll quickly move on to the final one. Postmodern research challenges the form and categories of traditional qualitative analysis. So qualitative research is always very critical of itself. And so this is where postmodern research has come from. So it involves questioning certainties and assumptions in the world, including the nature of truth, the ability of research and science to discover the truth, and all generalizations and topologies. So postmodern researchers are always asking, can the experience of another be captured, or is it created by the researcher? When we do our interviews in our focus groups, are we actually creating the data that we want from our interactions with our participants? Can any study be viewed as valid if traditional methodologies are flawed? That's quantitative and qualitative, to be honest. There's always weaknesses in any methodology, right? Can we ever truly know what is real? Is it possible to institute any real change in the world? So postmodern research is super interesting. All right. So for the last kind of 10 minutes before we go on a break, I'm going to explain reflexivity a little bit. We've talked about it when we were talking about phenomenological research. And then we're going to do an activity into the break. So qualitative research is very practical, logical, and critical of itself, as I said before. Researchers are constantly asking, am I accurately depicting the participants' experiences? Are we depicting the social world in the ways that I'm collecting and analyzing my data? Or is everything that has ever happened to me in my life distorting my interpretation of what I have collected and interpreted? Good qualitative research is the most rigorous and difficult research because qualitative researchers always come to their research with that mindset. Am I depicting my participants' experiences correctly and sufficiently? So reflexivity is a good way of doing this. So it involves the researcher reflecting on how they are positioned in relation to the research and to their participants. A reflexive journal should be kept at all times from inception of the project to when the research is published. And initially, we are reflecting on who we are as a researcher, who we are as a person, and how that influences our biases and our attitudes towards our research. So what gender am I? What social privilege do we come from? What's my sexuality? How does that influence the way that I see the world? Race, age, your immigration status, your beliefs about gender and queer theory, your beliefs about abortion, feminism, racism, white male privilege, Indigenous and disability rights, your political leanings, who do you vote for? What are your beliefs about euthanasia, the sex industry? What are your beliefs about pedophilia, like we talked about before? If you're doing a qualitative research project exploring non-offending pedophiles chats with each other in a Facebook forum, what sort of biases do you have to remove, or what do you come to the project believing about that? So it's really, really important. So we're going to do a little exercise for 5 minutes. And then you can go for a 5-10 minute break. So I want you to think about how you are positioned in relation to your research or just in the world, and write down your beliefs, your morals, your opinions and perspectives, and how they could influence your research design, your data collection, your interaction with your participants, how you analyze the data, and how you end up interpreting and reporting your data, keeping in mind those things down the bottom that we discussed. And we'll go for a break after that. So 5 minutes now will take us to 12, and then we'll have a 5-10 minute break at 12. And one of the main things about reflexivity is that it's always a personal account. You should never be asked by your supervisors, by a peer reviewer, to divulge your reflexive journal. The process of doing that would make you not reflect correctly if you thought someone else was going to read it. So it always must be your own personal thing. So for that reason, I won't be asking anyone to divulge their reflexivity exercise. So do your exercise for the next 6 minutes till 12 or 11, depending where you live. And then we'll go for a 5-10 minute break at 12. Excellent. Welcome back, everybody.
I did put a little bit there about my reflexivity in my project, even though you didn't really ask people, but my research is it's all out there now. I might have put it in the wrong place. You might have to scroll up.
Oh, where did you put it?
Oh, golly.
Oh, here we go. Reflexivity did influence every step of your research. It was an emotional journey, stated up front, my insider status and family connection. Very good. And were you all the way through keeping your reflexive journal?
Yes, I did. Yeah, my supervisors suggested it. So, yeah,
And how did you find
6
that
years.
experience?
Really good, really helpful. Just to kind of show how I was too close to the research in that way. Yeah, I guess I had to process my emotions.
Yeah, I guess.
How I felt about it all. But then like getting other files to compare and contrast, it sort of started making me a lot more aware that my family members' journey wasn't as terrible as others. So I could put it in a context. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Mm.
Very good.
I wouldn't recommend doing any family research, actually.
For that reason, it's very, very hard to remove yourself from the data.
Yeah, so in that way, you have to, you know, I put myself right in it all the time, if you know what I mean. Like, declared myself and declared my biases and my family connection, and that's what brought me to the research, and so highly reflexive, really. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Alison. Let's move on to qualitative research methods and the different types of ways of collecting data and the research ethics that surrounds qualitative research that are a little bit different to quant research. So when should we use qualitative methods? Well, qualitative methods should be used when variables can't be quantified, when they're best understood in their natural setting rather than in a laboratory or through a survey, when variables need to be studied over real time, when intimate details, roles, processes, and groups are needed, or when the paramount objective is understanding the lived experience of your participants. To do qualitative research, you must have requisite knowledge and skills about the methodology and the nature of your issue. So you also have to have that reflexivity at all times, understanding and acknowledging your biases, your assumptions, expectations, your values, what you bring to the research. You need to be an empathetic, intelligent, energetic, and interested researcher. Active listening must be one of your skills. It's really difficult to conduct and interpret research in qualitative research if you are unable to actively listen. You must be open to embracing multiple realities and questioning your own reality. And you must be able to produce detailed, comprehensive, and lengthy reports and be willing to do lots of work and writing, because a qualitative research project takes a lot more writing than a quantitative project. So the different types of methodologies, we'll go through these in detail now, are interviews, focus groups, ethnography, autoethnography, and content analysis. Interviews are a conversation on a given topic between a respondent and an interviewer. We use interviews to obtain detailed insights and personal thoughts, particularly on topics where the topic might be a little bit sensitive and the interviewee may not be willing to share their experiences in a group setting. It's flexible, it can be unstructured, but we usually use what's called a semi-structured interview guide, where you write your main research question at the top, questions that you would intend on asking your participant, and any prompts if they get stuck. But we don't just fire rapid questions at the participant and get their answers. We let them divulge, and we don't always read every question if a participant has already answered that question. So it's kind of very semi-structured. So there's the interview guide is definitely a guide and not and shouldn't be like answer, question, answer, question, answer format. They usually go for about 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the research. And the interviewer needs to be highly skilled, creating a relaxing, open environment and building rapport with the participants. If you don't have rapport with your participants within the first 5 or 10 minutes of your interview, your participant will not open up and give you any details about the topic. So it's a bit of a waste of time if you're unable to find common ground and build rapport. Interview transcripts are analysed for themes and connections between themes. Transcripts of all qualitative research have to be de-identified at the transcript stage before analysis. So can you provide an example of a research question that could be answered using interview studies? Feel free to use ChatGPT or any form of AI to help you answer the question, or you can come up with something that's related to your research. To what extent and why do you agree with a certain topic, Charlene? Yeah. How do students experience success in their studies at TAFE? That's very good. Although maybe that could be tailored more to a focus group, because the advantages of a focus group over interviews is that the participants tend to open up and bounce off each other in the conversation style. And usually with students, particularly about something that they're all interested in, you'll get richer data from a focus group. How do parents feel their child's ASD has affected their attachment? Yes, that's very good, and probably not something that would work in a focus group because it's a little bit more sensitive. What are the lived experiences and challenges faced by older male spouses in Western Australia that care for their wives with dementia? That's also an excellent one, because men in particular may not feel comfortable sitting in a group of other men whose wives have dementia and exploring their feelings and their experiences. So that may very well work better for an interview study. What are the experience of first-generation college students as they navigate academic and social challenges during their university education? Yeah, that's quite good. Also, could be a focus group as well. So the advantages of interviews: there is a tendency for a freer exchange. Can probe potentially complex motivations and behaviors. Easier to attach a particular response to a respondent. When you are transcribing focus groups, you have to listen for the voices and get the correct response, the correct voice for the correct person when you're writing your transcript. That doesn't happen in an interview because it's just the interviewee and the interviewer. It's good to use when the topic is sensitive and participants may not want to share in a group setting. The disadvantages of interview studies are the interviewer needs to have that expertise in rapport building and interviewing. Interviews can get quite stilted and very backwards and forwards, question, answer, if the interviewer is not skilled in conversation. It's very lengthy and expensive running interviews, and can lead to very small sample sizes. The vegan men motivations paper that we were talking about recently, review came back saying that 27 may not be a large enough number, which is actually quite a large number for a sample size for qualitative research. So that can often be seen as a disadvantage. Transcribing interviews is time intensive. Like I said, 8 interviews can take up to 40 hours to transcribe compared to maybe 8 hours for a focus group of 8 people. It's subjective and fuzzy. As we said before, everything that the participant says in an interview is related through the researcher and the lens that they apply to it when they interpret and report it. And there is a problem with social desirability bias, where the participant may want the interviewer to see them in their best light and therefore answer the questions in a much more positive way than what is real or true. Focus groups are the same as interviews. They're loosely structured, but 6 to 8 members all come together and talk about their experiences with a certain phenomenon. Usually incentives and refreshments are provided for participants to feel comfortable with each other beforehand. It's very conversational style. The interviewer or the facilitator of the focus group should say very, very little and should let the participants know that they should be talking to each other rather than to the interviewer. The facilitator is in control of prompting when the group gets stuck, but also making sure that people who have very small voices or quiet voices are heard, and directing conversation towards people who are not contributing, and trying to manage people who have loud voices who want to overtake or take over the conversation. They can be video or audio recorded. They last 60 to 90 minutes. What is a research question that you could come up with to answer using focus groups? Fatima's got one for interviews, students with online learning, which influence how interpret participants' responses. That's a good one because sometimes online students are unable to come together for a focus group study, and interviews are much better if you've got people with access difficulties, particularly people who work long hours, who may only be able to do an interview at night time, may not be able to come in for a focus group, may not be able to get them together. We're having this drama at the moment with a project where we want to talk to mental health clinicians about what their experiences are with giving nutrition advice in therapy, and they're very, very busy people. We're finding it very difficult to get focus groups of them together, so potentially online interviews of each participant will be the way that we will have to go. How do parents of children with special needs perceive the availability and effectiveness of support services in their community? This is a really great one, Melissa, for a focus group study. Get a bunch of parents together of children with special needs, and they get to talk to each other about their experiences with availability and effectiveness of support services. Some participants may have shared experiences that they will bounce off each other. Some will have different experiences where they haven't heard the other parent having that experience, and that would lead to a very rich amount of data with conversation back and forth between the parents. So that's a really, really good example. All right, we'll move on. Advantages of focus groups. There's a high richness of data from that conversation style rather than the question and answer style of an interview. You have the ability to study special populations together and their shared experience. It's easy to understand the data. There's flexibility in covering more complex topics. It may uncover unanticipated ideas that are important, and this commonly happens for us when we do focus group research. We always find novel things that we were definitely not expecting, so that's a really cool reason to do focus groups. It's usually the first step before we do survey construction, and it gives flesh and connectedness to real people in the way that they communicate. The group synergy brings on that real rich data. And the best part is that they are much faster to transcribe than multiple interviews. But again, we've got that small sample size, lack of generalizability limitation, which we really don't consider to be a limitation. Social desirability bias. What's really interesting is that in a focus group, participants will sit down and immediately unconsciously decide where they sit in relation to everybody else in the group in a hierarchy, and the group will unconsciously nominate someone as kind of the alpha. And that can influence the responses if that one person that is unconsciously seen as being the one who is the most intelligent or the most knowledgeable on the topic, people will lead to groupthink, which they will agree with that person whether they agree or not. Focus group studies are very subject to the researcher interpretation, which is why reflexivity is very important. It's quite costly compared to doing surveys. So say you get like 600 people in a survey compared to 6 to 8 people in a focus group study. The results are dependent on the skill of the facilitator in running the group and managing those personalities and interpreting the data. Interviews and focus groups are also just the participants' experiences at that moment. And those experiences may have been different a week before, 2 weeks after. So it's very cross-sectional. And we've got those strong personalities as a hazard. Now, the next one is ethnography. Now, this is split into two different ethnographies. We'll start with ethnography and move to autoethnography in a second. Ethnography is the observation of people, culture, customs, habits over time, and the differences between people in social settings. It's very common in anthropology and psychology, studying human society and culture. It uses a socio-cultural lens through which the data is interpreted. So researchers go out into the field and like observe people in their natural setting. To give like a cultural interpretation of how things are experienced as they are happening. It's a rich description of the culture, the beliefs, the traditions, the practices through the eyes of the group, and an interpretation of the culture through the point of an insider. So with ethnography in particular, researchers will sometimes spend years immersing themselves in the cultural group before they even start their research. So a good example of this one is say a researcher wants to see the inner workings of a bikie club, and they make friends with bikies for the research, and they get immersed in the culture and they experience the things that the bikie club does and are fully immersed before they even start to observe the inner workings of the club or how the culture is within the club. Can you provide another example of a research question that could be answered using ethnography or observation kind of as an insider researcher? While you're typing, I'll give another example. There was an anthropologist at the university where I was doing my undergraduate, and she did her PhD in the drinking habits of AFL football spectators, and her research involved her immersing herself in the drinking culture of the AFL spectators. So she would go to an AFL game on the weekends and she would drink during her PhD and immerse herself in the drinking culture. And she then wrote her PhD up over 3 years of what the different types of drinking cultures there were in the spectators. So that was a really cool ethnography, very immersed as an insider. What other examples do we have? Margaret Mead, talk to me about that, Alison.
She was a anthropologist back in the day, 20s and 30s, I think. And
Cool.
she did ethnographical field work on American Samoa, and she lived with the local people there. There's criticism that she got too close and lost her objectivity at their kind of traditional practices and, you know, traditional life. But yeah, she's an interesting ethnographer. Yeah.
Very good. Now, Natalie said, how do students experience the environment when out on excursion? So for that to be an ethnography, you'd have to get one of the children to be the researcher, because ethnography is where the researcher becomes part of the research, which is really, really interesting. What cultural practices and social norms shape the work environment and employee interactions in a family-owned restaurant? Yeah. So the researcher would go and work in the family-owned restaurant and work there for a period of time before they start doing research on the social norms and the employee interactions. Very, very good. Now, autoethnography is a tiny little bit different. Autoethnography is where the researcher does an autobiography connecting their personal experiences with cultural, political, and social meaning. So the researcher naturally experiences the phenomenon of interest in their world, usually from birth, and connects their personal experiences to the wider meaning. It uses deep and careful self-reflection, where reflexivity is even more important, and strives for social justice and making the world a better place. It's usually a rich description of lived experience from a marginalized research individual. And my favorite example of this one is there was a PhD student at SCU who was doing their PhD at the same time as me, who was on the spectrum, and their PhD was focused on how employers can best support people who are experiencing the symptoms of ASD in the workplace. And it was a bit of a story or a narrative around his working life, the employers that did really well and the employers that did not do very well in supporting him in being the best employee that he can, and then tied it all back to the literature and the evidence based around ASD, and then ended up with recommendations for what employers can do to fully support people who are on the spectrum in the workplace. It was beautiful. It was amazing. So can you provide an example of a research question that would use autoethnography? It was an awesome PhD. It was one of the best things ever. And he finished when I was about 12 months in. So he was a massive role model for me. And we called him Dr. Doctor because he had 2 PhDs. But he was very, very, very good. What other examples can you come up with? The PhD details will be on the SCU website. I could try and find it. But all PhDs are in the SCU repository.
What's it?
Mine would be in there too.
What's his full name, I guess? If you can
Would
remember
it
his
be-
surname.
I can't remember his surname. It
Oh,
was
it's
Peter.
okay.
But you'll be able to find it. It'll be in there. Or I can find it and send it out.
Yeah.
What behavioural strategies teachers use in classroom and the children's responses to these? Could be. Usually the phenomenon is something to do with the researcher's identity from birth. And usually it's striving for social justice from a marginalized researcher. So the ASD example was a very, very good one because his experiences in the workplace were experienced in that way because of his symptoms. Yeah, that would probably be more ethnography. So it's a little bit harder to think of. So the advantages of ethnography is that it can provide a rich lived experience that no other research method could ever provide. No one else will ever be able to write that PhD. You have an ability to research groups and cultures that have never been researched before. A really good example of this is the stuff that's being done on the gut microbiome of native populations that have never been exposed to the Western dietary pattern. There's only 2 of those left in the world, unfortunately, and it scares me every time a researcher goes and interacts with them because I'm worried they'll give them a chocolate bar. Ability to understand marginalized groups from the inside, which is really important because we all have this same shared human experience. It's highly reliant on researcher interpretation, though, very much so, like all qualitative research, but it can take years and years for the researcher to integrate themselves into the cultural group before they even start their research. And in some instances, it can be dangerous or call to question researcher confidentiality and ethical practices, like with Margaret Mead, how she got too close to the population. But when we consider the first example of the researcher who integrates themselves into the bikie group, they could put themselves into a very, very precarious situation because they would have to be taking drugs, selling drugs, other illegal activities that are happening within that group to fully immerse and integrate. And they could end up in jail or killed, or if they get found out, things like that. So it can be quite dangerous. Ethics usually is quite difficult to get these types of things through. Narrative and content analysis involves the use of stories or life narratives, first-person accounts of experiences. These stories are used as data, taking the perspective of the storyteller as opposed to the larger society with the goal of extracting meaning from the text. Content from social media is a common source for content analysis, where people's ideas, experiences, and opinions are generally far less filtered than other forms of research. So funnily enough, interviews, focus groups, ethnography, you will find the participants, what participants really think about something on social media far more than you will ever get from any other type of research. It's really interesting how unfiltered people are, even when they're not anonymous. So we take these pieces of content or narrative or historical documentary, and we analyze the words and the meaning behind the words. So can we find an example of narrative content analysis? My example was the hashtags, the postpartum hashtags, to see what postpartum women's experiences were. We also had the example before about the closed Facebook group of non-offending pedophiles. Any other examples that we could use content analysis to explore? People's memories of big events like the Lismore flood. That's a really good one. We could even have a look at social media posts from the flood and just see the people's experiences in real time as well, and then compare them to memories. We could get participants to write stories about their experiences. Yeah, that would be really cool. All right, we'll keep moving. Advantages of content analysis. It's useful for gathering information not commonly accessed by other research methods. So we can look at books, we can look at social media, we can look at historical records, drawings, diaries, anything that's been written and is publicly accessible. It's cost and time effective. You don't really need research ethics if you are accessing something that's already public. It's the best way to access individuals' real unfiltered experiences and beliefs, and it's a great way to compare things between now and the past, as Alison did. Disadvantages: data analysis can be time-consuming if there's a lot of content to analyze. So imagine if I looked up every hashtag that was hashtag postpartum. I could imagine there would be millions of hashtags to read. It's susceptible to researcher bias and interpretation of those documents. The researcher is unable to control the dialogue or topic being asked, as it has been done in the past. Information could be lost or tampered with over time, and you may miss the initial context that produced the text. So this is particularly pertinent in social media because people can erase comments. So if you're following a string of comments and people have removed some, the context could be lost. Or if they remove the original post and you can only see the comments on the post that was originally there. So you are not in control of the analysis or the data as much. So really important, qualitative research ethics. So very similar to quant, but there's a couple of differences. So with interviews and focus groups, we must get informed consent. It doesn't have to be written like in quantitative. Participants, if you audio record your interviews or your focus groups and your participant agrees to informed consent verbally on the audio, that is okay. Confidentiality and anonymity is a hard one in qualitative research, particularly in focus group studies where there's 8 other people in the room. We cannot guarantee confidentiality. We cannot guarantee anonymity. Participants may leave and discuss what has happened in the focus group. We ask them not to, but we are not in control of that. We need to protect participants' identity and personal information as much as we can. All transcripts of all audio recordings should be de-identified before analysis, removing participants' names, family names, partners' names, places of work, places of study, anything that could identify them if someone read their transcript. Participation should be voluntary, and participants should leave the research in the same state psychologically and physically as they entered the research. So interviewing someone about something sensitive, the participant should not be leaving crying and in a worse state psychologically than when they entered. If they are, then we provide support for them, and not ourselves. So we don't provide psychological help ourselves, but we do point them in the direction of where they can get that from. Right. So that is kind of what we are covering today. Next week, we are going to move into analysing qualitative research. So we will be looking at using in vivo and other ways of actually analysing words and how to do that effectively. We'll talk about narrative and content analysis, so the study of patterns of communication in text, like we talked about with social media and the historical documents. Discourse analysis, which I think is what Alison did, which is the study of verbal coherent sequences of sentences. Is that what you did, Alison?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I was drawing from psychiatrists' patient files from the 20s and 30s. So, you know, they had a particular way of speaking about. So I chose mothers. So it was very, the power imbalance, the gender imbalance, the stereotypes and assumptions about women's role in society, all that was very strong. But at the same time, you've got to remember they were writing government reports, if you know what I mean, or mental health files. So it was quite specific use. Yeah.
Very cool. Then we have grounded theory, which is coding categories, and the most commonly used analysis is thematic analysis, where you identify, analyze, and interpret patterns of meaning. And the most common form of that is thematic analysis, is reflexive thematic analysis, which was brought about by Virginia Braun and Victoria Clark. It focuses on examining themes and patterns of meaning within the data, and we will do a deep dive into reflexive thematic analysis next week. And I'll show you how to do that from the first to the last stage. There's a large focus on the advantage of the reflexivity, so we will have another go at that reflexivity exercise next week, or build upon what you've done this week. And these are the 6 stages of thematic analysis that we will go through. So you start by familiarizing yourself with the data, by actually doing the interviews, the focus groups, and the ethnography is part of the familiarization stage. So engaging with your participants and what they're saying, listening back to the audio recordings, and then transcribing the data is all part of that familiarization with the data stage. Then we move on to coding, where we code into 2 sections, code labels and codes, to find out the meaning behind each of the participants' quotes or pieces of data. Then we create themes, usually 3 to 5 themes, with those over the umbrella over those code labels and codes. We review the themes, we define them, we write our thematic analysis. And as I said, this is not a linear process. You go backwards and forwards through this process all the way through your analysis, and you can be writing up your thematic analysis and your theme names can change. So that's very, very common. So do we have any questions about qualitative research methods? We've got some things in the chat box. Susan, I have a couple of general questions. Is it okay to use current clients or people we know as participants? Ethically, no. But you could get another facilitator to facilitate the focus group or the interviews with people that you have a personal relationship with. We have that. That's happening for me at the moment in the project, where we are looking at mental health clinicians' experiences with nutrition advice is that there's a whole group of academics that I work with who are clinicians who would like to be part of the research. So I just get one of my honours students or one of my PhD students to facilitate the focus group so that I facilitate and also analyze and transcribe that focus group. So that removes that conflict of interest. Are all SV supportive of qual, or do we need to look for a specific SV for honours? Supervisor, is that? There are several supervisors at SEU who are supportive of qualitative research. I would look for a specific qualitative supervisor just because they understand the methodology and the ways of analyzing the data. If you choose a quantitative researcher who doesn't have any experience, they may not be able to guide you as well as a qualitative researcher might be able to. Can you use open-ended questions as a qualitative component of an online survey? This would be de-identified data. Yes, absolutely. Open-ended questions in a survey are a really good way of getting qualitative content. As I said before, in the body image and the postpartum survey that we did, we replicated that study later on and added open-ended survey questions to that to find out what the mum's experiences actually were and why they answered certain questions in certain ways. Melissa has her hand up. Would you like to put your microphone on and ask your question?
Hello, thank you. That was awesome. So quick question. When we were doing the activity and reflecting on our beliefs and morals and biases and things like that, I started thinking, like, aren't we being influenced by everything kind of all the time? Like from when we do our lit review to when we start getting our data in, like obviously we're not robots, not yet anyway, but you know, so is that the whole point of that reflexive like journal, is just to be aware of how it's impacting how you get the data? Is that essentially it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so the activity that we did today is the first stage of reflexivity. So that's where you look at who you are as a person, all your beliefs, all of your attitudes, and what you believe about the world. And then that's the very first stage that you start with, acknowledging your biases. And then all the way through the process of your qualitative research, you engage with your reflexive journal and write down your thoughts and opinions and how your ideals are changing or your values are changing from your literature review, engaging with participants. Quite often you'll do a focus group and hear different things that have changed your worldview. You can like write that in. So we're at all times reflecting on our thought process and what is happening, so that when we get to that writing up, we can read back over our reflexivity and ensure that the way that we were thinking during every step of the process doesn't influence the interpretation of the data.
And then do you sort of speak to that when you write your thesis? Is that essentially what you do? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there should be a whole paragraph in your methodology section stating what your position was at the beginning, whether you were an insider or an outsider researcher. So, for example, I have a couple of students in doing their honours on postpartum body image. None of them have children yet, so they will do a couple of sentences on being an outsider researcher. You talk about like where you were positioned, obviously not divulging personal information, but like things that are important to the research. Like we would suggest in our vegan men project, there's a whole paragraph on how we understand that we're not men, we're not vegans, that we want to look at the world through the eyes of the participants. We acknowledge that what our biases or our opinions are, and that could influence the end up interpretation of the data. So yeah, there should always be a reflexive paragraph in qualitative research.
Awesome. Thank you.
Amazing. Are there any other questions? Thank you, Chrissy.
Excellent. Any last questions for Megan while we still have her with us? I'll be able to send out PowerPoint slides and stuff later. Hey, so
Yeah. And I might also include the Braun and Clark reflexivity exercise. It's a
Right.
2-page A4 guide on how to start reflexivity and how to continue it throughout your research process.
Excellent. That'd be great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Everyone seems very happy. Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everyone. I might finish up there.